implementation of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development.
Yep, definitely.
Thank you. Okay.
This report is in response to a resolution made at your September committee meeting, and the purpose of it is to provide an overview of the key aspects of the new National Policy Statement on Urban Development and Council's proposed plan for implementing it. And that includes a work stream to improve the design quality of multi-unit development, and we'll be reporting back to you on options for that aspect of our implementation program in the first half of next year. Just quickly, a reminder of what national policy statements are and how they fit into the plan hierarchy. The NPS is a statutory instrument prepared under the RMA. It sits at the top of the hierarchy, and it is used by government to prescribe objectives and policies that are of national significance. And the matters of national significance that this NPS seeks to address are around having well-functioning urban environments that provide for community well-being and providing sufficient development capacity to assist in particular with improved housing affordability. Ultimately, this NPS is designed to allow more urban development and housing through RMA plans and planning decisions to ensure sufficient opportunities are available to meet housing and business needs, ensure the competitive operation of urban markets, and assist with housing access and affordability. You'll recall that we had a national policy statement on urban development capacity that was introduced in 2016, and we've done a lot of work to implement that in terms of our housing and business capacity assessment and our future development strategy, which you signed off a couple of years ago now, our space. And then in August last year, the government said that they wanted to go further and released a discussion draft, and the council provided a submission on that. Essentially that draft was signalling, although there weren't prescribed directions in that, but it was signalling that they were looking to promote much more intensification of our urban areas. And we provided a submission which talked about things like concerns about the one-size-fits-all response not being appropriate for a Christchurch context. It seemed like a sort of an Auckland issue that we were needing to address. Lack of need when we have reasonably good housing affordability compared to some of the other Tier 1 authorities, costs on council, etc., etc. Government then released its final NPS in August 2020. It now has full effect, and it addressed some of our more technical concerns, but not really those big issues that we raised concerns about. The key differences between the old NPS and the new NPS: we still have to undertake monitoring of urban development indicators. We still have to have a solid evidence base, including preparing housing and business capacity assessments. We still have to make sure that we have a future development strategy or a spatial strategy in place, and in particular that responds to any shortfall of housing and business land capacity. What is new is that we are required to remove minimum car parking rules, accept disability or mobility car parking requirements, and we're to do that without using the usual Schedule 1 consultation process. There are very, very strong intensification directions in specified areas, although up for unclear in some aspects in terms of their definition and application. There's a new direction in there to be responsive to unplanned and out-of-sequence development which provides significant development capacity. So that's a new policy direction that we did signal that we had significant concerns about in the draft. It essentially paves the way for development like greenfield development that we is currently not anticipated or planned for. In terms of the intensification directions, the NPS says that in these particular areas we need to intensify to specific levels. So in the city centre zones, realise as much development capacity as possible to maximise the benefits of intensification. So it's potentially unlimited, but maybe not if that's not maximising the benefits of intensification. In metropolitan centre zones, which we don't currently have, but we're directed to apply the nearest equivalent zone, we are required to enable at least 6-storey development. That doesn't mean that that 6-storey development must occur in those areas, but the plans must enable it. And the 6-storey requirements also apply to the walkable catchments around those centre zones and also existing and planned rapid transit stops. And it doesn't stop there. We're also required to look at all other locations of the city and enable density and height commensurate with the level of accessibility and or demand, whichever is the greater. The NPS sets some statutory timeframes which we must meet, and they're identified in that table there. Work is underway on a number of those, the first of which is the July 2021 deadline for an updated housing capacity assessment, not business. Removing car parking minimums, we've started that work and we have notified a plan change for consequential amendments to address that as well. And work is underway to look at the intensification provisions and with ECAN and our other partners to insert criteria for what significant development capacity means, which has to go into the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement. So our high-level process at this point for meeting those statutory deadlines is set out in this diagram. So this, where we are here, is outlining the key requirements, and we've started work to identify the spatial areas for the intensification directions. It's quite unclear at this point, so there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done to look into that, and also the qualifying matters, which the NPS enables us to look at the circumstances where intensification may not be appropriate, but it's quite a high bar to meet, so we're still working through what that means for us. The next step in the process is to report back to the committee in a couple of weeks' time to talk about the definition of metropolitan centres and city centre zones and walkable catchments. In terms of the quality design aspect, work is underway looking at issues that have been raised with the existing RMD and RSDT areas and what it will mean for intensification at 6 stories and higher, and we will be reporting back on the outcome of that work in the first half of next year.
Thanks, Adele and David. Just for additional context as well, it would be appropriate to update councillors on the conversations that are occurring with local government New Zealand. As Della said, all Tier 1 councils, so major cities, are in the same situation. This is now a legislative requirement from central government, so we are working closely with our colleagues in other councils and also with LGNZ, and they're taking the lead on their liaising with MHUD and MFE on the two critical issues from our perspective. The first is around definition, so as staff talked about what a definition of a metropolitan centre is, what definition of walkable distances are and things like that, and the second is qualifying matters, which the earlier deputation referred to, and qualifying matters relate to whether there are provisions or whether there should be exemptions from any of the now legislative rules in the NPS. So we're looking for consistency and alignment between councils. All councils are obviously now conscious that different decisions made by different councils will variously expose councils to legal risk about how they interpret and how they define these things. So we are trying to work as closely as we can. We're still waiting for much of the national guidance, notwithstanding that this is already now in effect. This legislation is in effect, so the legislation took effect before any of the national guidance was issued, but we are working with both LGNZ and also directly with government, and I'm sure Andrew will talk to some of the other issues raised by the metro sector mayors that are affecting their councils as well.
Thank you. Questions? Leanne?
Sorry, I have to go. I'm laying a wreath on behalf of the citizens of Christchurch for Armistice Day, so at the Bridge of Remembrance. So, and I would like to participate in the debate, so I won't use questions to debate much, other than just to note the extreme frustration with central government imposing Auckland rules on the rest of the country, particularly here in Christchurch when we've been through a land use recovery plan, an entire replacement district plan process. It does seem very frustrating, particularly when over-intensification is a big issue for our residents, and it is something that we're committed to addressing. So can we, we've got the some suggested alternative amendments there, but the question is, because there is a legitimate question, whether I've got the right wording. So I've identified that the National Policy Statement actually requires us to change the district plan, including the removal of minimum parking requirements, which must be implemented without consultation by February 2022. So that's an absolute. We have no say over that whatsoever, and people don't get a say, even though we've heard from Deputy Chair Helen Broughton that around the implications of that requirement, that is a given. It's an absolute.
Yes, for the car parking, there is no exceptions. Yeah,
right.
That's right.
And the intensification requirements, they will have a public consultation, but they have to be notified no later than August in 2022. Correct. That's right?
Yes. Right.
Now, it's the second one that I'm really concerned that I've got the wrong wording. That we're asking you for further advice on definitions within the NPS, and that's good. And the basis for exceptions, but I'm just wondering if that phrase is right. What I meant was that language of qualifying factors or whatever it is. Is that sufficient direction to you guys?
Yeah, that captures it.
Yes.
You know what it means?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. And the staff you will also provide advice on council's desire to restrain over intensification. It's right clear in the paper that you're doing that for us, but I just kind of wanted us to have it specifically out there, because that's what the councillors want to do in terms of backing their residents. Yeah. But it is a challenge, is yes. What you're telling us. Absolutely. Good. That's all, and I'll have to go, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Tim.
Yeah, thank you. We in the paper it's got the requirements from 3-storey to 6. Is it still covered with regards to protection of the neighbours, with regards to like being so close to a boundary, etc.? So although the National Policy Statement wants us and is directing us to go to in certain areas up to 6 stories, or even up to 3 stories in areas that have only ever maximum been 2 stories, that is still controlled by the distance to the boundary, etc.
So the NPS doesn't preclude us from putting and introducing provisions in our plan to deal with effects like who we're discussing in terms of relationship to boundary and access to light and things like that. The extent to which recession planes can be used, we might be a little bit limited. It doesn't say that we can't, but MFE has signalled that if recession planes do overly limit the ability to intensify, that we need to look very closely at the need for those. But where this might come to with the density done well package, if you like, is that in order to deal with all those boundary effects in particular, sites may need to be larger and amalgamated. So we're not suggesting it's 6 stories on a small site, right, or 3 stories,
or because I know we have had in the past in Addington, a couple came to us. They had restored a villa, and then there's a 3, or whatever it was next, and they got that on the other side. So what's the point of them doing up their beautiful villa? And so they sold it to a developer and that got bulldozed. And then we're destroying the amenity. So I think we've got to be very careful when we look at what we're doing the other way round. Just a comment. The other question, sorry, I had was Helen, when she presented, mentioned she'd been advised by Wellington flexibility. But flexibility in my definition perhaps is very different to the gentleman or the lady that you've been talking to in Wellington. So do you have some ideas on that?
So that's to do with their qualifying matters, and the NPS itself specifies what those are in 3.32, if you care to look. But it's a really high bar. So they are matters like, the ones that are listed are matters of national importance that are set out in the Resource Management Act. So it's around natural hazards and significant heritage values, natural features and landscapes, significant indigenous vegetation, like really important nationally recognised values. And nationally significant infrastructure. One example might be the airport noise contours. But there is a matter under clause H, which is any other matter which makes high density development inappropriate in an area. So that's the sort of grey area. But the guidance has said that is a very high threshold, and we have to go through the plan review process and justify it under the RMA Section 32 process. And protection, I think it's pretty clear from MFE that protection of existing amenity values is unlikely to be an acceptable qualifying matter. And not on top of that, the guidance says that and the NPS says that you shouldn't be using that to have blanket protections over areas. If there are values that need to be protected, whether it's if it's a natural hazard, for example, you don't say, okay, the whole area is a no-go area. You have to look at it on a site-by-site basis and go, okay, well, this one might be out, or this part of this one might be out. So it's really looking at that very fine-grained detail.
So the last question, I think, is, so technically those areas in our city which are regarded as character areas would be under threat with the national policy statement? Because we've still got to work through that, but
my personal view is that areas that have gone through a robust planning process like we have through the IHP process, and the character areas that survived that process, if you like, are probably good contenders for that. But those areas that didn't make it through that, the evidence threshold, if you like, from that process will be much harder to justify.
Thank you.
Kia ora, and thank you for really making it very clear about what we actually can't do here, and thank you, Helen, for the outlining those things. We are being told what to do here, and council has very little choice in how we respond. But I'm thinking about the parking issue. How closely are we working with ECAN in terms of providing public transport options for people who won't be able to use their cars if they can't park them? How's that happening? Is there a relationship? How close is the relationship, and what's happening in that space?
That's right. Yeah. So whilst we can't obviously not remove the minimum requirements, the NPS does strongly encourage us to look at how we address parking issues and through other means, and one of those could be through public transport. So yeah, we are working closely with ECAN. Obviously there's a future public transport business case at the moment that's been developed, and we know there's a big relationship between the availability of parking and the encouragement that gives to people to drive versus the use of public transport. So this could be a chicken and egg situation. If there's less parking, we might be able to get more people on public transport, which gives more funding for public transport, and we could improve the services. So yeah, there is a bit of a situation there where we can work together, and we are working together on that. So yep. And I know there's a parking strategy coming to you in the next month or two. Yep.
Thank you. Mel.
I've got 3 questions. One is in the MFE guidance on like what definition of walkable is. Why do you think they've left it so open? Because it does make it really hard to interpret. So I was wondering why you thought they'd done that rather than just saying it must be 400 metres or 5 minutes.
I believe it was left for councils to define because there was an acknowledgement through the discussion draft process that there are some areas, particularly areas with steep hills, people live up on hills, like Wellington, for example, where 800 metres might not be appropriate because it's hard graft getting around, whereas in a flat city like us, it's easier to walk, so you can walk further distance. But it is internationally well recognised that walkability is somewhere between 400 and 800, but possibly 800 and more, depending on the environment.
Second question was, in those 4 locations, you know, the central city zone, that table, can you just explain the bit about in all other locations about enabling density commensurate with the level of accessibility and or demand? Because I don't really understand what that means.
We're still working through it as well, but our understanding from MFE is that we're required to look at general accessibility around the city, and we have got some tools to be able to do that in terms of our levels of service for transport, in terms of which areas of the city have good access to key services like amenities like schools and supermarkets and things like that. So in those areas, the direction is that we should be intensifying because they're accessible to those things, but it may not be. They've left it to us to determine what the appropriate level of intensification is. So they're not specifying it must be 6 stories, but the assumption is that we will look to whether it's infill or 2 to 3 stories or whatever it is, but to intensify around those areas of good accessibility. The other areas of market demand is a little bit more unclear. The guidance suggests that we look at a number of metrics in terms of what parts of the city people are looking to locate in, to build their houses, to buy their houses, the parts of the areas of the city where there are lots of resource consents seeking to go denser. And so looking at a whole lot of metrics to work out where the market is saying they want intensification and to enable it in those areas, but they've left it to us to determine how much. So it's quite grey.
Yeah. And then the last question was around the car parking. So, and it's been brought up before, but just to clarify about, like if a new mall was to go in, say somewhere, or whatever, they wouldn't necessarily, or a business wouldn't necessarily need to have any car parking. But is that right? But they wouldn't, yeah.
So, well, yes and no. So, we're not allowed to have minimum parking standards in our district plan. It's left to the developer to determine what quantum of car parking they need for their business. And they may, and in the circumstances of supermarkets, they tend to want to provide more car parking than our plan indicates they should. So they're probably going to do that anyway. The flip side to that is that if you have a resource consents lodged where a development might be a high trip generator, generate significant effects on the local network, or generate issues of safety in terms of the design of access and things like that, but where that development may generate effects, and one of the mitigating methods for addressing those effects may be to provide car parking on site, that may be something that can be required as part of the resource consent process in terms of managing effects, but we can't actually require them through the plan. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, we're still trying to work through exactly what we can and can't do. It is, as you've said, a lot of this is quite, there's grey areas here. But yeah, our ability to require parking is going to be very constrained. Yeah, so
The tool that the government is suggesting we use to manage that off-site parking is parking management strategies. So it refers to those in the NPS, and it's saying you can't require minimum parking, but make sure you've got the tools available if there is on-street parking stress. Make sure you've got the toolkit there through a, what's the actual term that they use? The
comprehensive parking management plan.
So that there are tools available to, whether it's to start charging for on-street parking or metering or those sort of things. So that's, and we do have that for our suburban centres and our central city underway.
Yanni.
Yeah, thank you. I just sent some additional resolutions to be included in the, well, separate than the amendment, but additional. I just wanted to check because I don't understand the process between this and the Greater Christchurch Urban Growth Partnership, where I see, like, when I read the cabinet paper in Auckland, it seems quite a collaborative, working together to address all the same things that we're being asked to do. So I just wondered if anyone can kind of give an update on if that process overlaps, or if not, why not? Because I just don't quite understand it.
I can probably talk a little bit. So, as you'll be aware, the Greater Christchurch Councils are currently out consulting on the Greater Christchurch 2050, and Greater Christchurch 2050 is anticipated to be the precursor to the conversation with government about a urban growth partnership, or under the urban growth agenda cabinet paper that you're referring to. So an urban growth partnership is a formal agreement between local authorities and the government that traverses both urban design and transport issues generally. They're the kind of two large elements, and they variously exist in Auckland, the Auckland to Hamilton corridor, Bay of Plenty and Wellington, and so we've been talking with central government on the development of a urban growth partnership to reflect the anticipated development across Greater Christchurch in the next 30 years, but we need to conclude the Greater Christchurch 2050 piece of work in the first instance.
So when is that likely to come back to us for consideration?
Next year.
And do we know when, like end of next year, or?
I don't have the date off the top of my head, sorry. I'm anticipating that it would be in the middle of next year. All of the local councils, including the regional council and central government, would be in a position to talk about the next steps following on from the consultation from Greater Christchurch 2050.
And what's to stop us from doing it earlier? Like, why wouldn't we actually agree to the partnership before we spend all this time and resource doing all the work?
Well, the way the partnership is set up is that you, first of all, need to have a plan for what you want to achieve, and then the partnership is expected to deliver on that plan. So Greater Christchurch 2050 is the first part of that.
Thanks. Just the other question, final question from me was just trying to understand the implications of this for things like Mirabelle Mall, which has obviously got a resource consent to expand, a whole bunch of issues there around car parking, I presume. Would this kind of, what does this do to like existing consents that have been granted in terms of things like that, for example?
So this would take effect. In fact, it essentially takes effect. The car parking changes. The NPS takes effect as of August. We've still got the parking rules in the plan, so they still need to comply with those. But they could use the national policy statement as a matter to consider through that consenting process until we remove the parking requirements by February 2022. So yeah, if Mirabelle Mall was going through another consenting process, then they could take account of the NPS and use that as part of the consenting process if they wanted to vary the parking requirements. That's an option for any developer.
Just while so that's just a variation to the consent. They would just seek a variation based on the NPS. effectively.
They could do,
Yeah.
yeah. Or they could wait until the parking requirements are removed by February 22, and then they no longer need to comply with the parking requirements in the district plan. So.
Jimmy.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding to the amendment, paragraph 3, I would like to ask staff, particularly regarding to those intensification directions. In here, whether staff, before staff present this further advice to the council, whether you will go through the consultation, particularly regarding the definition, like intensification or metropolitan center, whether it's a whole kind of suburban center, just part of that. I just want to know whether still through this consultation process or just you create by yourself idea. Yeah.
So in terms of defining what is a metropolitan centre and the city centre zones, staff will do the technical work as they would implementing the National Planning Standard anyway, because it's part of the National Planning Standard. So we will do that initial work and brief council on that in the next month or so. The opportunity for the public to have a say on that is when we go out for pre-plan change notification. So part of that plan change process, that plan change will identify the areas subject to intensification and the design provisions and everything that go along with that, and that is signalled on the process diagram, I think, to occur at the beginning of 2022.
So you mean the public or community still opportunity to feedback to the council?
They will at that point. Just bearing in mind that that plan change process is a statutory process prepared under the Resource Management Act. So if any person is looking to reclassify or come to a different conclusion on what those centres are, they still have to meet the same tests in the Resource Management Act. So they still have to have the same evidential basis for it, if that makes sense. So it's evidence-based.
And
Clarify that on the one hand, the car parks, not going to be able to put car parks outside residential areas, but malls are going to be able to create more car parks. Is that correct? Is that what we're hearing? Have the ability to have more?
So there's nothing in this National Policy Statement that prevents people providing car parking. So if they want to provide car parking, then they can. There is some rules in our plan in terms of where car parking is located. So in some zones we will require consent for parking for amenity purposes in some cases. But this is about removing the minimum number of parking. It's not about limiting setting a maximum amount of parking that you can provide. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. That's clear.
Tim.
Thank you. I guess when we go out to consult on this in 2022, as per your plan, I think we've got to be very clear and have councillors have a good understanding, and especially relay that to the public about what they can really kind of question and what they can kind of ask for change. Because as we've heard from Helen, her definition of flexibility from Wellington was one thing, but the actual flexibility from Wellington is really, really limited to things that really are, you couldn't really take effect anyway because they're protected already. So I guess when we use that word consult, we've got to be really, really careful with it. Because my concern is the public think it's the council doing a lot of things, whereas our hands are tied. So why would we car parking? How could we consult on something we can't control?
Like any plan change, we have to give effect to those higher order documents that we outlined on the triangle. And so anyone else that does a private plan change or wants a change to the plan still has to give effect to those higher order documents.
But what I guess I'm saying is you can go out and consult and people say, I don't like this, but that's really great, but it doesn't do it, it doesn't affect it. But what can they truly question, and actually what can we change?
Tim, we're not in debate just yet. Phil?
Yeah, thanks, guys. Did I get the question? Did I get the impression that if cars are out of the people's driveways and they're parking down the street, we'll then have to go and get permits for parking a car on the side of the road like they do in Wellington? It seems to be a daft way of doing something.
No,
did I get that impression from what you said?
No, I suppose it's up to council. It's up to you as to how we manage the on-street parking. So there's nothing in this NPS that says we must require permits or limit on-street parking at all. It's all about we can't require off-street parking. So I suppose what I was alluding to before is there's I think Central City parking policy that's being developed and that will come to you, and there is tools that we can use to manage on-street parking, and that will be entirely your choice. There's nothing in the NPS that forces you to do that or not, as to how you want to manage on-street parking. We made a decision that we'll just keep it the way it is and just see how it goes. So yeah, there's absolutely no requirement to do permits.
But those tools are there available to make use of.
Yeah, well, I don't. Yeah, and one last question: we have no recourse at all to push back on this parking thing, or we have?
No, we pushed back with the submission that we did last year. This is, from what I understand, it is subordinate legislation that was given rural assent. So it has that effect. Yep.
All right, excellent. So we've got the 4 in front of us, which I'm happy to move. Do we have someone to second those? Thanks, James. Also, we've had a couple come through from Yanni. Firstly, the first one, Yanni, it's probably best to rewrite that the Christchurch City Council request a meeting with local government MPs to raise concerns over the impact of the NPS-UD on. The second one, actually, the Minister can't grant an exemption on the what you've actually asked for the exemption to be put for. So I can't accept that as an amendment because he can't do that. So.
As Mike said, that we can write to the Minister, but it would be inappropriate of us to ask the Minister to do something that legally the Minister can't do. So that under the legislation, the Minister can't grant an exemption from the NPS on the basis of the second part of that paragraph, which is about constructive collaboration under an urban growth partnership agreement.
We've had a housing school in the past, we've had lots of unique arrangements in terms of the city. So I don't know who is responsible. Someone must have power to do it.
Well, it's a law now that has rural assent, so no one can choose to not follow the law, including the Minister responsible for it. So.
Just in terms of probably the question about the urban growth partnership, I mean the parking requirements, for example, don't just apply to the 5 big cities. They apply pretty much to every district in New Zealand. Every district that has more than 10,000 people in it, and most of those are not having urban growth partnership discussions with government. So this has to be done regardless of urban growth partnership discussion.
question.
Excellent. So Jake was happy to second that, but before we just go into debates, because we've obviously got 2 amendments, I'll just check. James, would you be happy to include that in?
Yeah, we're sort of doing all this stuff anyway,
and
so fine.
Yanni and Jake, you happy if we just include that into the substantive now instead of actually, okay, cool, we'll just all put it together, then we can just debate it all as one. Okay, debate. James.
Yeah, look, this national policy statement is nothing more than an Auckland policy statement. I think we all know that. We could do with streamlining council processes and the planning consenting pathways, but also incentivising what we need more of and limiting what we don't. But I think we all share the same feeling and sentiment around the table that this just does absolutely none of that. Some of our biggest planning issues in the city relate to parking, or lack thereof, and deeply inappropriate intensification in residential zones. So this will only exacerbate what is already broken. There's no sense in me voting against the resolutions up there, as it's just really for receiving and noting. And I would obviously like to stress, if that's not already clear, that my seconding of the recommendation is purely pro forma. But at the very least, I just want to take this opportunity to have on record how horrifically tone deaf I think this Auckland policy statement is, and how it is nothing more than attempting to cram a round peg into a square hole. So, you know, it's really sad for Christchurch, I think, when we see stuff like this. And I will be supporting the recommendations.
Andrew.
Thank you. I think it's important to note that these are noting provisions here. We're receiving a report. I mean, certainly agreeing to these resolutions agrees to the further work being done on the report back. It doesn't mean that we agree with this NPS. And this really is an Auckland solution, which feels like a really poor fit for the rest of the country, including Christchurch. Is designed to deal with a demand problem. We actually don't have a demand problem here. In fact, in parts of the city, including the central city, we've got exactly the opposite, hence the fact that we've still got a number of vacant sites. For example, the 7-storey limit put in the city, into the central city after the earthquakes, was designed to see a larger number of sites developed less intensively so that we got site coverage and we didn't end up with vacant sites. The idea put forward by this NPS that we should allow no height limit in the central city almost certainly would lead to an intensification of development across a smaller number of sites. So a small number of high-rise buildings and a large number of sites remaining vacant. That indicates to me that this is not a good fit for Christchurch. So there are some things that we need to do, and the further work will inform them. We absolutely need to explore the opportunities for exemption or qualifying matters, is the technical term. We need to ensure that our interpretation of metropolitan centre, which again is an Auckland expression, it's not one we use here in Christchurch, is well understood and is appropriate for what we want in Christchurch, and also the definition of walkable catchment, and there's been some discussion of that already. We need to make sure that we do continue to use our district plan to the extent that we can to deal with over-intensification issues, and there are plenty of examples of those that have been brought to us by various communities around the city, not least by deputation this morning, and that we end up using the district plan to get appropriate outcomes for Christchurch rather than the type of over-intensification that destroys local amenity and which is not supported by our communities. And we also need to fully understand and fully consider the relationship between intensification, which may well be imposed on us through this NPS, and the need for supporting infrastructure. So these are all decisions that we may quite possibly not naturally make for the city, but there is obviously a relationship between the need to intensify, imposed on us by this NPS, and the resulting imposition of the need to fund and create supporting infrastructure for that intensification. So there are a few things here that are quite important. I do agree that we need to be working with government to find a way through this. We need to be engaging with the appropriate minister. We need to be engaging through LGNZ with other cities. There needs to be a joined up approach across the country to mitigate legal risk of different interpretations. I look forward to the further work being done, and that's the only reason I'm supporting this today.
Mel.
I agree with what everyone said. One thing that hasn't been brought up, but is in this paper under the risks, is about the cost of this to council and our ratepayers, because we need to, our staff have got to spend time working out what the definitions are and going through the district plan and making the changes to probably, it's a very intensive process. It needs to be done over a short period of time. Across the whole country, when we've just had COVID-19 and all councils are under financial stress, including our own. So I think if the government wants to, has introduced these changes, they should actually follow it up with some budget. So I challenge our MPs and the government to do something about it.
Catherine.
I think this is incredibly frustrating. Knowing, especially from the community where I represent in Central Riccarton or the Islam area, Upper Riccarton, when we've been fighting the issue of intensification in our area, this is just a further blow to that, and it's really frustrating to have just being told by people who don't quite understand how our community operate, and I think it would be the same for the wider Christchurch as well. And I think it is incredibly frustrating that we are being imposed with the same rules from a complete different city that's very different from ours. While I'd be reluctantly supporting this because it is just a paper of receiving and noting, but I really look forward to hopefully arranging a meeting with the local MPs and having a further discussion and hopefully getting them to understand how our community needs something different and something a bit more tailored to our needs and our requirements.
Okay, Sam.
Yeah, thank you. I think James Goff's probably put it the best today in terms of, I think, an Auckland problem that's been pushed on the rest of the country. I mean, it's very clear this is an Auckland plan that's been even worsely written by Wellington bureaucrats, and I don't think it's something we should, accept as a city. And look, I'm the same. I'll reluctantly support the recommendations, but I would urge the public of Christchurch to contact your local members of parliament. There's absolutely no excuse that this needs to occur here, and everyone in the city, whether it be residents or residents groups, can literally rise up, write into your members of parliament and get something changed. We have a government that has a clear majority. There's absolutely no excuse that this needs to exist. So I'd urge people to write in, tell your MPs that this is unacceptable and protect Christchurch.
Yanni.
Thank you. I understand the sentiment behind what's trying to be achieved with this policy statement, and in fact reviews of the RMA have been quite critical of government not providing enough national direction. But if anyone in the country needed less central government direction, it would be Christchurch. We've had that extensively after the earthquake, but before the earthquake, we'd already done a really comprehensive piece of work on a greater Christchurch urban development strategy, which actually sets out most of the things that this policy statement was trying to achieve, but was actually done with the community. And so I can't see any need for government to be telling us what to do. We did actually try and improve the L3 and L4 zones in 2012 through Plan Change 53 to address some of the amenity issues. We had Share an Idea, we had the Christchurch Blueprint, we've had the Housing Accord, we had the Land Use Recovery Plan, we've had the District Plan Review, we've just had, in 2008, the Future Urban Land Supply Strategy. We're currently doing a Christchurch 2050 strategy, and we're now being asked to do this. It just makes no sense at all. And a number of things in it are just totally contrary to the community being involved in planning at a local level. There's no doubt in my mind that this city has been over-planned for the last decade, and we don't need more work and resources going into simply doing more planning. What we actually need to do is get a stable base from which to develop. So we should be going back to government, I think, quite strongly and saying this is not the right approach for Christchurch. We've been over-planned at the moment. We actually want to work constructively with you through the Urban Growth Partnership to address some of the concerns that you may have. But actually this policy statement will not deliver on the benefits that we need in terms of our community. And so therefore, I will support the information coming to us, but I think we do need to be strong in going back to government, seeking an exemption and seeking a better way of doing urban development.
Jimmy.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah. I'm still reluctant to support, but still support, because while we try to find an alternative way, can make this national policy statement, urban development, to more practical, more implementable. So that's the way. So engage with all the local MPs and write the letter to the responsible minister to let them know, this the kind of document. It's not just fit for the Auckland super city. Should be covered, all kind of the metro city, but need to more fit for purpose. That's very important. Particularly, we heard from the deputation, Helen, regarding those kind of the remove those car parking area. That's quite seriously, particularly like Catherine mentioned earlier, in the Rickson area, Upper Rickson area, or even in the Hornby area or some other the activity center. This will make getting worse. The other one is if definition the staff provide to us, if some of the suburban area is kind of the metropolitan central room, but at least 6 level, 6 stories. I just don't know whether this kind of the beast or not. It's a big effect, to those the visual amenity, etc. But at least regarding this amendment, we might have seeking alternative way, can continue the negotiation, continue have conversation with the local MP and with the responsible minister. So I'm support this one.
Thank you. Tim?
Thank you. Look, for the reasons given before, and I do think James Goff and Sam McDonald's 2 comments have been really highlight the whole problem. When we talk about cost to council, it's not just to this unit, but if you look at the work that's got to be done right through our council, and I mention that because one of the simplest things that people will be able to understand is parking. Without any on-site parking required, I've been waiting 3 months to get white lines to define residents' car parks on a residential street that has issues with people parking over them. So our council is not able to react quickly to this changing environment. So we've got to do a whole lot of work through this whole organisation to keep up with this NPS, which has been over-engineered for the last 10 years. And if you try and get someone towed when you're rushing to work, you've got to wait for the officer to get here, double check that it's actually right, then they've got to call the tow truck, etc., etc. It's just one simple thing, and affected by this whole NPS, we are actually not geared up to manage. I went to a workshop with council, or a working party, a government working party in 2013 with council lawyers to explain to them that Christchurch had the best future planning for land development than any other city in New Zealand, and it wasn't listened to then, and it's still not being listened to, which is a real shame. They talk about intensification. The residents of Christchurch are okay with intensification, but as we've heard, it's about the quality of that intensification that is so important, and just jamming heaps and heaps of residency on one site reduces the value of what you have for the human beings living there. And we've had that in other developments we've had in the future. I thought we had learnt something from those developments along in the old days from Braham Street, etc. It seems that we haven't, and the government hasn't either. I totally support meeting with our MPs and talking to them about this. And as Sam said, I really do hope our residents pick this up and write to their MPs, because it is being driven by Wellington, fairly sadly based on Auckland for Christchurch and other areas. So I will be supporting this because it is actually starting that ball.
Thank you. Anne?
Obviously, we're all really concerned about this and we feel very powerless about it, but I think it's about identifying the things that we can do, and I think those have been mentioned, going and meeting with our MPs, getting action through writing to them. Also, it's encouraging to know that LGNZ is actually doing some work with other TAs to actually raise concerns, and that collective voice will be really important. So we're receiving these today and support the changes there. We need to work together to make a stand against these things that are being imposed upon us.
Thank you. Do you want to?
Sorry, and I don't normally rejoin a debate, especially when I haven't heard what people have said, but I've had an opportunity to reflect quickly on the additions. And the one thing that I'm going to add to all of this is that every single residents group that I've spoken to about this issue have said how much they support intensification. It is a really important focus, particularly for our future and for environmental considerations, that we intensify those areas in an appropriate way, so that we are able to see developments within brownfields rather than greenfields developments in the far off distance, which will see further stress go on our city. And the costs are sheeted home to us every time a corridor opens, the Northern Corridor. Every time there are increased opportunities for development out in the outer reaches, you get urban sprawl and you don't get the benefits of the proximity that cities can enable. We've still got a lot of work to do in our central city, a lot of work. And, I'm really intensely focused on the need to build momentum around getting those inner city residential developments going, and every time we push things out into the wider regions for greenfields developments, that's another wasted opportunity in terms of the intensification that happens. Every single residents group I've talked to have expressed concerns about over-intensification, the removal of trees, the removal of amenity, and the increased pressure of car parking, and that's been raised over and over again. It's been raised in Riccarton, Addington, Spraydon. You've probably gone through all of these, Maryvale, Richmond. You just list them, especially in those areas that are within relatively close proximity to the central city. So we're not opposed to intensification. We're not opposed to the concerns that have been raised or sought to be addressed by government through the National Policy Statement. What we are concerned about is that this is a one-size-fits-all approach, which has picked up an Auckland issue and created an Auckland solution and imposed it on the rest of the country. In Christchurch, it doesn't belong. It's not a good fit.
Thank you. Well, it's always good when we have one voice. So on that note, I'm going to put it. All those in favour? Aye. Opposed? Carried. I'm going to adjourn for 10 minutes, so we'll restart at 11:35, and Phil will take the chair for the last two items.